guess the only thing I'd offer on 3.4 is, at least for me, one of the, if you want to think about like why it's where it is and the flow of like the sections and what it's doing, one of the ways I read it is it's kind of placing representation into the discussion more fully, um, which is really kind of like why I think it's between 3.3 and 3.5. 3.3 kind of ends having explained how representation functions in the primitive, right? And 3.5 is going to pick that up and take that even further. So 3.4 is this weird kind of like in Mesa, it's discussion of it, almost like a linking block. But yeah, picking up on these last two paragraphs. So the first thing would be like, if you notice, they're emphasizing sexuality here, which for D and G is basically like, yeah, it's their way of talking about production and reproduction, which is like it's basically the three syntheses,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And that's kind of their general point here, is that what's being introduced through representation is a way of kind of desexualizing the unconscious, right? So basically going at odds with the three syntheses, or in a sense, trying to understand production without entering it through production, right? And that's kind of the stymie, where basically what they introduce, right, is like we have to choose between libido and Newman as though they're substantively different, right? And that's the trick, because libido is Newman is voluptas, right? All three are the same. So
Yes.
that's kind of the desexualization there, right? Is talking through the syntheses um, without talking through them in terms of production, right? And that's basically what function versus meaning becomes for them, right? So much so that like I've compared the framework to like a kind of derivation, right? You can think of this kind of like, Derrida's "there's no outside text," right? Something extra textual that explains the text that's being introduced. I also like the way they talk about it as a form, right? It's as though a form is imposed on the unconscious, and the form is going to tell us what it is, right? I think that's probably one of the more clear ways to think about it. Um,
Would agree.
and that's really all I think I have.
Yeah, and as we move into territorial representation here, and I'll get underway in just a moment. Um, the as we talk about this, the big deal to remember is that repression operates. There is no like total absolute freedom. Repression is an operant thing. It's part of the larger machines. How it works, where it comes by, how we find it varies greatly depending on the sort of larger social superstructures that sort of exist, and the social formations that operate. So how we learn about repression, how we become repressed, how desire becomes repressed shifts. And we're going to be getting into that because, again, the thrust of the book is really about how repression happens and how men come to desire their own. And so through this chapter specifically, we begin actually starting to answer that question. Isn't that nice to finally get there? So I'll just get underway. Well, I'll start over. Well, representation is always a social and psychic repression of desiring production. It should be borne in mind that this repression is exercised in very diverse ways, according to the social formation considered. The system of representation comprises three elements that vary in depth: the repressed representative, the repressing representation, and the displaced represented. But the agents that come to carry them into effect are themselves variable. There are migrations in the system. We see no reason for believing in the universality of one and the same apparatus of social-cultural repression, or refoulement. One can speak instead of a coefficient of affinity that varies in degree between social machines and desiring machines, according to whether their respective regimes are more or less similar. According to whether the desiring machines have a greater or lesser chance of causing their connections and interactions to pass into the regime of the social machines. According to whether the social machines execute more or less of a movement of detachement in relation to the desiring machines, and whether the death-carrying elements remain caught in the machinery of desire, encasted in the social machine, or, on the contrary, joined together to form a death instinct that extends throughout the social machine, crushing desire. I like this paragraph. It's pretty crisp. There's some things to note. And then I'll sort of open up for questions, because it's a very good place for us to sort of really start. If you're confused about any of these things, this is the start. They're beginning these things. They're bringing up stuff from before. So if there's anything here that's an issue, now would be the time for sure for questions. But as I said, the big thrust here is within different social structures, repression happens differently. The representation, as they've talked about it, we talked about the paralogisms earlier. The paralogism that they're mainly sort of speaking about here with representation is that one that talks about the repressed representative, the repressing representation, and the displaced representative, that odd image that seems to be what we desire. But the goal of this is to talk about what puts them in place. They don't really believe in, and I think it's a fair question to sort of ask and a critique, why is repression always operant the same way? This would be very much Freud's argument, is that repression is a universal. It affects and works the same kind of everywhere. That to them doesn't make a lot of sense. I think Lacan is not exactly far away from that either. Repression being this sort of operant way of sublimation of desire, et cetera, it doesn't really work the same way everywhere. But we see no reason for that. Instead, we've got to talk about the specific line in here, which is there's instead a coefficient of affinity that varies in degree between social and desiring machines, according to whether their respective regimes are more or less similar. So before we get into breaking down the next few sentences, that's the thing they're really wanting to drive at. Again, they've really gone a lot of ways to talk through desire, and they'll be getting a lot more into this later, but desire and repression and all these elements, it's a materialist framework. And as they're doing this, they really want us to be talking about sort of the maths of the thing, the functions of the thing, how these things interact. Because when we talk about the coefficient of affinity varying in degree between these social and desire machines, it comes down to whether the social machines and desire machines are more or less similarly produced, whether their machines operate the same. What is that coefficient of affinity that shifts? And you'll kind of get, when we were talking earlier about how desire is directly in line with sort of social in the sort of territorial system, and how that shifts, as they sort of say in the next few bits. Like, first, it's according to whether desire machines have a greater or lesser chance of causing their connections and interactions to pass into the regime of social machines. This is a pretty binary, easy thing to talk about. It's, hey, the desire machines, are they interacting directly with social machines? Are they passing into that? Where is the connections and interactions that desire machines work when we're operant against the social machines? The second bit that they have is, one sec, my eyes skipped. According to whether social machines execute more or less of a movement of detachment in relation to the desire machines, is, again, how much do they extricate, how much do they separate the social machines from desire machines? Because they are, again, remember, they're sort of one and the same thing, but they operate at different regimes. And then the third bit is whether death-carrying elements remain caught in the machinery of desire and casted in a social machine, or joined together to form a death instinct that extends throughout the social machine, crushing desire. This last one's a big one. There's a lot said there. We'll get to that, but these are the sort of three parts they want us to be thinking about as we make our way through. The coefficient of affinity varying between social machines and desire machines, about whether or not their regimes, the two sides of it, are similar. Does this make sense as I'm saying it? Because it is a very complex paragraph, but it's actually said fairly cleanly. I can give examples if it would help, or if everyone's getting it. I don't want to harp on this if everyone's understanding.
It seems clear to me, thanks.
All right. Is that anyone having trouble with it? Because otherwise, we'll move on.
When you talk about representation, would it be something like in terms of language, or in terms of the symbolic? Is that the representation is referring to?
Representation in general, according to what the paralogism sort of laid out. So it's not so much just language. We'll get to how language functions. It's not so much an image or anything. It's representation as per how it works within that paralogism.
Okay. So this whole process of representation is the repression of desire and production. And that is all three parts of this process is a paralogism.
Say that one more time for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah. In other words, is this idea of representation a form of paralogism?
It is one of the paralogisms. It's their critique of representation. Yes.
Okay. Oh, it is one of paralogism. It's not a okay.
Yeah, it's
not.
Jack, do you want to put in a word on that one, because I might be saying it slightly off, and I know you're more of a stickler with the wording.
I'm the wow and flutter to this reading group, aren't I? If you get that reference, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, another deep cut for you. Yeah, so it's the fourth paralogism, right? So this beginning part, what they're basically doing here is they're just restating the fourth paralogism really briefly, which is to say that representation itself is not a question of language like it might be with Lacan, like you noted with the symbolic, right? So like, the critical mass moves to the big other, and that's because language castrates, the real in a manner of speaking. On the contrary, what we're seeing here is more like, we're seeing more that the three parts of representation and repression are the repressor, the repressed, and the represented, which in primitive are alliance, the germinal influx, and Oedipus, right? Kind of in the order I listed before. So that's what actually does the displacement of the tension between desiring production and social production, right? So this provides not only the form, but the actual repression and the stand-in for desiring production, or just decoded flows within the relationship between social production and desiring production. That's why it's kind of like they're talking about through coefficients, right? So in the sense that you kind of have, fixed variables, so to speak, and varying degrees of deployment relative to each group, right? So that you have a kind of traveling universal, but it's always based in kind of a particular. And it's also subject to change with each like the particular itself is not necessarily a constant thing, right? It's going to change, even though the repression in a manner of speaking is kind of consistent.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, and it's important just to go over, because it's a thing that it took me significant amounts of time I think through our second reading before I started to really understand that this isn't the sort of, I want to say, popular or colloquial version of the I'm told I want something, so therefore I can't have something, so therefore I want it. That simplicity of that, people get it. People are like, oh yeah, no, but it's not really what's happening here. Instead, there is a third thing that they're adding, because traditional sort of psychoanalytic thinking is, if I tell my son, you can't have a chocolate bar, he will immediately want a chocolate bar. The thing that happens in that interaction, that's sort of the third layer that they're adding here, is the represented, the referent, the sort of third element. And it's that the image created of a chocolate bar is actually what's created. It's not a direct thing. It's not me saying generally chocolate bars. It's not as simple as just no, 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 yes, yes, yes. It's no, you can't have this. Well, fuck this. This then also creates a broken image. And this is where the nature of Oedipus and representation, they say, works sort of its most brutal, where we're discovering the thing that we can't have in the same time we want it, because that's the other layer, is it's defining that thing for us. Again, to go back to the territorial, when if you were to say to someone inside of the, this type of socialist that doesn't really have, hard social rules, you go, you can't fuck your mom. They'll be like, hey, whatever. Cause they don't have mom. Mom is an image. It's a category. It's a specificity around a person. And that thing, that image didn't really exist as in the same way. Representation didn't operate in the same way. So that's the layer they're talking here is, well, how does representation then operate if we don't have, Oedipus and this other sort of odd bit of this referent of desire? How do these things operate? And that's what they're going to be getting into. Does that help at all? Or does that make sense, Jack?
Yeah, I think I follow what you're trying to say.
Cool.
To kind of expand it, or to kind of give a sense of an example, right? It's like if you look at the three parts, right, for the primitive at least, it's the alliant doing the repressing, it's the germinal influx upon which the repression bears, and it's the image of Oedipus, right, as that which is represented. So if you think about that, every time you're slicing different groups, so to speak, the alliant is going to change because it's the political and the social. So that kind of condition, that kind of functionality is going to vary by group, even though we're still looking at the social and political, right? Which is part of your disjunction as well, at least at the level of social production. Within each group, right, the question of the germinal influx will be perennial, but that too is going to vary, right? The states of desiring production, social production will vary, but that's what's going to get repressed. The image of Oedipus is going to get, shall we say, applied to that differently each time, right? And then that last bit about the agents, right? So basically what they're saying is within each group, right, we have this kind of, we have global persons, so to speak, right? We have aggregates. That's going to vary so that they become agents of repression, so to speak, with each group, which, Deleuze and Guattari are going to walk that out more, but just to kind of give a light sketch of what them and Brutz are talking about, that's kind of the basic schema for it.
Yeah. A great secondary read, and it's on the server. I think I've uploaded it 1,000 times, so I won't be doing it right now, but it's Holland's Introduction to Schizoanalysis, his writing on Anti-Oedipus. He goes really nicely through the paralogisms and specifically expands on this one because it is kind of the foundation of a lot of their critiques and of a lot of things as we make our way through. So we'll make our way to the next paragraph, which is good. It's got a little Nietzsche in it, and Nietzsche is always nice. Society is not exchangist. The socius is inscriptive. Not exchanging, but marking bodies.
Wait a second, Brutz. I think you skipped a paragraph.
I did. My bad.
You saw Nietzsche and you were like,
I was excited.
I gotcha.
God damn it. All right. The principal factor in each of these respects is the type or genus of social inscription, its alphabet, its characteristics. The inscription on the socius is in fact the agent of a secondary psychic repression, or repression, quote, in the proper sense of the term, that is necessarily situated in relation to the desiring inscription of the body without organs, and in relation to the primary repression that the latter already performs in the domain of desire, a relation that is essentially variable. There is always social repression, but the apparatus of repression varies depending in particular on what plays the role of the representative on which the repression is brought to bear. In this sense, it is possible that the primitive codes, at the moment They are acting on the flows of desire with a maximum of vigilance and extension, binding them in a system of cruelty, maintaining an infinitely greater affinity with desire machines than does the capitalist axiomatic, which nonetheless liberates the decoded flows. This is because in the primitive socius, desire is not yet trapped, not yet introduced into a set of impasses. The flows have lost none of their polyvocity, and the simple represented in representation has not yet taken the place of the representative. In order to evaluate in every instance the nature of the apparatus and its effects on desiring production, it is therefore necessary to take into account not only the elements of representation as they are organized in depth, but the manner in which the representation itself is organized at the surface, on the inscription surface of the socius. Jack, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'll just start with some points on what I think are probably some of the more interesting or perhaps even challenging parts of the paragraph. So like when in my previous explanation, I was focusing on agents relative to global persons. Here, Deleuze and Guattari are going to focus on it in terms of inscription, right? So they're talking about the second synthesis upon the socius and upon desire, upon the BWO, right, the molecular level. So in that sense, they're just kind of moving the angle so that the use of Newman, the inscription itself, can still act as an agent of repression. What does that mean? In a sense, it means it's distributing the three parts we discussed earlier, which in various forms you kind of get in this paragraph. Skipping a little bit ahead, there is always social repression, but the apparatus of repression varies. And this is a constant theme in this paragraph, depending in particular on what plays the role of the representative on which the repression is brought to bear. So there's kind of two senses of that. One is every socius that's going to differ majorly. For our purposes in the primitive, though, right, so the germinal of flux is going to be something kind of different because it's not it doesn't have an essence per se with each group, right? So you might say like the propensity to create through the disjunction, right? Whatever that is per group is going to shift, but it's always going to stand in for decoded flows and kind of for desiring production in a sense, right? That's kind of why you have that aside about, somehow, even though capital decodes flows, right? And that's the true terror by which repression kind of staves off. Somehow, that is further away from desiring production and social production in their affinity, right? So what's unique about the primitive is how close together they are, despite the use of coded flows.
Yeah. And a big push here. Sorry, if you want to keep going.
No, please.
So a big push here is also to really spend some time thinking about how the inscription happens. I don't want to say how memories are created, but it is a little bit of that. When we talk about the Earth Socius, for example, and we talked a little bit before, it's the very simple Marxist version that we and our environment sort of as one sort of move forward. We carve into the earth and the earth builds us. We don't, rice paddies are built where they're built. You don't do that in a desert. These things, people and experiences and production happens not in a vacuum, but instead in a material position. And as such, desire itself also does this. Desire and people and all of this, these things are also materially existent. So when we talk about sort of how these things are recorded or inscribed, as they talk about it here, this is the big deal that they're pushing back for us to understand, is how the inscription of things happen. And it's not so much the memory, because memory, I think, if I use the term, it tends to have I have a memory of being 6 years old, but more the pangs of memory, when we talk about this, it's it is, memory is probably the best word for it. It's just, we're not talking about particular memories. We're talking about how do you have the push forward, or how do you have the regulations to not just appropriate desire? As we talked about before, the nature of sort of the social systems is that you don't just immediately consume desire or find a thing to consume for it. You don't just, as a hunter, eat your kill. You don't just, as a mother or father, have sex with your children and appropriate these goods and this desire for yourself. That thing, how do you stop it? Well, you have to do that through some level of repression. And their argument here is that we can see how the repression operates by looking at the type of social inscription, the way that these things are recorded over time and built into people socially and into people directly. The line, there's always social repression, but the apparatus of repression varies. It depends on the role, what plays the role of the representative on which repression is brought to bear. This way that these things are recorded is the big push. And it's this line that's at the bottom of 184. This is because in the primitive socius, desire is not trapped. It's not introduced into a set of impasses, this flux that's lost. It's none of its polyvocity. The simple represented in representation has not taken the place of the representative. People deal with things imminently. They record socially. They're right there. In order to evaluate every instance, the nature of the apparatus and effects on its desire and production, you need to take into account not only the elements of representation. That's not it, this is a line sort of directly at Lacan and a whole bunch of like Reich and Freud. It's not that. But instead, you need to talk about the manner in which representation itself is organized at the surface, on the inscription surface of the socius, how things are written into the socius, how a tribe knows its history and how to behave and what to do. It's not the 10 Commandments. Things are known socially. This is the way you do stuff. There's codes, social codes. How do codes get recorded? How do you set them up? This is the thing that matters to them. And it's a big play because representation is kind of core to their critique across the board. And I'm just going to move right into the next paragraph. Any questions on that before? Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I don't want to cut off the questions, but just because I wanted to focus on that line you read just a little bit more.
Go for it.
And the simple represented in representation is not yet taking the place of the representative. So what that means, right, at a really general level, is that in the primitive, the repressed, which is the germinal influx, is different than the represented, which is Oedipus, right? What they're saying here is that the affinity between desire and production, social production, is so close, so intimate, if you like, because Oedipus, well, it's going to be Oedipus, right? Because Oedipus isn't that which stands in for the decoded flows. So one way to understand that, right, is the decoded flows of social production, but also those of desiring production at large, right? Oedipus doesn't stand in for them in the primitive. When we get to particulate capital, right, that's going to be different. And that's where we're going to see this kind of distancing between social production, desiring production come into play, which, to remind you of the states of the fourth paralogism, right? That's a big deal because in the primitive, we're dealing with a displacement in terms of the intimacy of desiring production, social production. Whereas when we get to capital, the distancing now takes place so that you have a different kind of displacement, right? And that's in large part, as they're saying, because Oedipus now takes the place of the germinal influx, stands in for those uncoded flows and decoded flows.
Yeah, exactly. It's the inscription that matters. The inscription is what sort of sets up that repressive sort of force. How it's inscribed. The process, I should say. I shouldn't say the inscription literally. Now to read the part that I was going to read before. That I started to, like a jackass. Society is not exchangist. The socius is inscriptive. not exchanging, but marking bodies, which are part of the earth. We have seen that the regime of debt directly resulted from this savage inscription, for debt is the unit of alliance, and alliance is representation itself. It is alliance that codes the flux of desire, and that, by means of debt, creates for man a memory of words. It is alliance that represses the great, intense, mute, filiative memory, the germinal influx as the representative of the non-coded flux of desire capable of submerging everything. It is debt that articulates the alliances with the filiations that have become extended in order to form and to forge a system in extension, representation, based on the repression of nocturnal intensities. The alliance debt answers to what Nietzsche described as humanity's prehistoric labor. The use of the cruelest mnemotechnics in naked flesh to impose a memory of words founded on the ancient biocosmic memory. That is why it is so important to see debt as a direct consequence of the primitive inscription process, instead of making it, and the inscriptions themselves, into an indirect means of universal exchange. There's a lot said here. Just some top-line things. There is a common view that society is always about exchanging. I give you goods, you give me goods. And there's kind of this never-ending expanse. It's a universal exchange. Yay. It's not really how it works. It's certainly not how it works inside of the Earth Socius, but it's not really how it works anywhere. Instead, ultimately, it is about debt. It's about debt and mobile blocks of debt. It's about how debt moves between people and around society. If we go back to the times they're talking about and the examples they used, and there will, again, be going through Maus in a second, which is great. Ultimately, when you have and exist socially inside of these groups, you know what you owe to other people kind of all the time. You know that your daughter married into a family, so you are owed X. You know that you do work for these. You know this setup and these relationships are debt. You know you owe the tribe X, Y, and Z. How it's done, and they bring it up here. It's a genealogy of morals. If you haven't read it, Nietzsche's great. And we'll get into very specific stuff. But when you talk about the cruelest, and I never pronounce it right, mnemotechnics, it's memory flesh, basically, to remind you, to set you up, these really horrifying rituals that they put, usually pubescent, post-pubescent men and girls, boys, through carving into their body, chopping off parts, doing all sorts of insane shit. That thing they're doing is imposing the memory of words founded on the ancient biocosmic memory. So you don't forget what you owe. It's kind of the idea they're pushing here. We'll be getting into sort of how that works in a second, but that's the push, is to understand that it's important to see, as they say, debt as a direct consequence of this primitive inscription process, instead of as an indirect means of this universal exchange and trading, that there's always this debt floating around. This is how alliances exist. Is that fair, Jack? Fair phrasing?
Yeah, I mean, it's right, like it's the unit, like you guys are saying. So there's a couple things in this paragraph that, in a way, is just bringing forward previous ideas, but kind of retooling it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So right, like this point about debt and the point about alliance, this should all look familiar from 3.3. I believe it was, when they're going through the right. So the incest is the kind of the chasm or limit between kind of the inclusive use of the disjunction, or the inclusive use of inscription, and the exclusive use of it at the socius, at the level of social production, right? one of the big things being pointed out here is, especially because alliance does the repressing, right? Within the fourth paralogism, it does the repressing. We're interested in how it not only does that, but how that plays into the actual disjunctions, both in their ambiguous use and in their more paranoiac use, right? And that's, in general, that's kind of what's getting pulled out of this paragraph, so as to get it like, I think you're actually pronouncing it correctly, or at least that's how I say it.
Mnemotechnics. It's a weird
Yeah.
phrasing.
It's just a portmanteau, right? It's the technology of memory.
Yeah. Well, so here's the question to be pondering, and it's the question I think that they're getting at here. They don't, I think, state it this bluntly, but man, it's an old Bertolt Brecht. Brecht always had so many good lines. I feel like it's a Brecht line if I had to pull it out of my brain. But we're always shocked when we see someone stealing from a store, but there are so many people going hungry. Why isn't everyone always stealing from stores? Like why isn't this happening? And I think you can apply this to any society. Why is it that people aren't just immediately gratifying and doing the thing that's in front of them? Like, why isn't that the case? There's no society on earth where that's the case. You're just gratifying whatever the fuck is going on. Instead, there's always this repression that's stopping this instant gratification. And how do we, for example, as they're going through it here, how do we talk about these tribes who don't have, sort of written systems? They don't have, the economics we have. They don't have large scale power structures. How is it that they don't do this? Well, to them, it's this inscription. It's, what does it take? And this is, again, if we go back to genealogy of morals, because that's what they're referencing here. You need to use you need to hurt someone really, really bad and be super cruel to make sure that people have a memory of what they're not supposed to do. Basically, it's I think he phrases it as an unmediated life, how to prevent an unmediated life, because it's not so much that like primitive societies are terrified of incest. It's kind of not that our society is either. It's instead that there is what incest would mean as a thing is that you would have desire not blocked by this sort of repression. And this exists to code things, to code the flux of desire so that it can circulate through society properly, so it doesn't escape the grasp. So it's this way, this as they call it, the savage system. They're going to be getting into that wording shortly. That gives this collective memory, that gives these tribes the ability to not just always steal all the time from everyone, but instead that there's these rules and codes that everyone has to live by under pretty significant threat. And that's the phrasing they're getting into, and they're going to be getting into really fast here because we got Mouse, who's great. I have to give credit. And of course, Levi Strauss, who they're going to play with a little bit here. It's going to be a whole thing. So I'll just get to the next paragraph and keep moving. Unless anyone has a question, I'll leave it open for a moment. It's one of those great questions. Why isn't someone stealing all the time? Why isn't everyone always stealing? Why isn't everyone always doing that? Well, there's forces at work. Why? Are we scared of police? It's not any, like, we're built in certain ways. We exist in certain ways socially. And that thing, that start position, why is that there? How do we get to this point? What is the things that make it? This is what they want us to take a look at.
While we're dwelling on all this, before we move to that Moss
Please.
paragraph, yeah. So a couple of more things to pull out here. So notice like paroles being used, but like in general, notice that they're not lodging everything in terms of language, kind of like we mentioned earlier. At least not. See, this is kind of interesting how they do this. It's not language per se. It's codification, which in the primitive, right, it means we're basically just dealing with signifiers. So it's funny. It's both Lacanian and sort of not exactly Lacanian. And one of the things I would highlight here to that point So when you see this use of cruelty, uh, there's a couple people involved in that. I'm going to focus just on Artaud for a second, because of the mnemotechnics, but also because um, in this book, they're going to contrast, psychoanalysis and its like kind of theatrics, right? Placing the unconscious on stage with how they think the unconscious works, right? With this point about cruelty, at least for Artaud, right? One of the main differences between
can I say, because we're going to get to that paragraph, it's like 3 paragraphs away, because we're not quite at cruelty yet.
well, no, they just used it binding themselves in the system of cruelty, right? Like
Right, but they're going to be expanding on that specifically with Artaud in like 3 paragraphs, right? No?
okay.
It's a lot to layer in right now. Actually, let me see. No, it's like 5 paragraphs away. All right, never mind. Sorry, it's just a lot to layer in. It's there's a lot happening inside of this. So
That's okay. I'll do it briefly. The point I was just going to make is that for Artaud, right, it's language functioning in a metaphysical way, whereas for like kind of strict drama, right, it wouldn't be really doing that. It would be kind of in a more performative sense. So like the implication there is that with this use of cruelty, right, we're talking about the syntheses, whether paralogistically or syllogistically, whether incorrectly or correctly used. And here to do that, right, we're using them in such a way that we're generating codes so that inscription is making signifiers, so that with this technology of memory, right, the actual technology, the use of inscription is generating these signifiers, which you want to take in contrast to asignifying desiring production. And we can focus on that more as the paragraphs go.
cool. Cool. Everyone, we good? No? Yes? Maybe a little? It's possible. Fair enough. Then I'll continue. There is a question that Marcel Mauss at least left open. Is debt primary in relation to exchange, or is it merely a mode of exchange, a means in the service of exchange? But Levi-Strauss seems to have closed the question again with a categorical reply. Debt is no more than a superstructure, a conscious form, whereby the unconscious social reality of exchange is converted into cash. What is involved is not a theoretical discussion of the first principles of anthropology. The whole notion of social practice and the postulates conveyed by this practice are at issue here, and the whole problem of the unconscious. For if exchange underlies everything, why is it that what takes place looks like anything but an exchange? Why must it be a gift or a counter-gift and not an exchange? And why is it necessary that the giver also be in the position of someone who has been robbed, so as to demonstrate clearly that he does not expect the exchange, not even a deferred exchange? Is it theft that prevents the gift and the counter-gift from entering into an exchangeist relation? Desire knows nothing of exchange. It knows only theft and gift, at times the one within the other under the effect of a primary homosexuality. Thus, the anti-exchangeist amorous machine encountered by Joyce in Exiles and Klasowski and Robert, quote, in Gourma ideology, it is as though a wife could only be given or carried away, kidnapped, hence, in a certain sense, stolen. Every union that could too manifestly appear to be the result of a direct exchange between two lineages or lineage segments is, in this society, if not prohibited, at least widely disapproved of. So this is actually a really simple point, and they're making it, I think, in very particular ways. But if you've ever been around a 2-year-old and taken a toy from them, do you think that and you go, hey, don't worry, later I'll give you 3 toys, don't worry, and you just ran away. Do you think they handle that well? No, they do not. They don't really understand or get the concept of exchange because that's what it is. It's this secondary abstractive layer. Instead, desire just knows that it's giving a thing or a thing has been taken from it. It knows that the thing is there or not based on basically that's it. So their question is, and they want us to really think through this when we talk about the exchange of things, when we talk about society being exchangist, desire doesn't do this. This is in the social space. We can have this conversation and talk through it, but it's not really primacy. This is about the unconscious. This is the point. Because if exchange underlies everything, why is it that what takes place looks like anything but an exchange? Why must it be a gift or a counter gift and not an exchange? This is their question underneath it. This is what they want us to be thinking about. Again, getting back to the unconscious and desire and sort of desire's forces, desire as a force. It only knows theft and gift. At times, the one within the other, under the effect of this primary homosexuality. That's a whole other thing we can get into if you really want me to get into it. But it's this, it only knows these things itself. It only knows the things that it is. It doesn't know exchanging anything. It doesn't get any of that. This is why very often, and they use examples of Klosowski or Joyce, but then they actually dive right into, I want to make sure I get the footnote right. God damn it. Footnote is always at the end. Every time. 330. I believe that's, that can't be right. That's got to be that's the wrong section. There we go. I was on a roll and I broke my own stream. Clans, groups, lineages, and familiars of the Gourmand, or Gourmand as a tribe, as Michel Cartre. He noticed, and it's a fantastic thing to notice, kind of super important, that it's not so much that you were aware of this exchange, even though we talk about the exchanging of brides or families. Oh, my daughter will marry your son, this exchange. It's not really how desire doesn't fucking get any of that stuff. Desire doesn't know social stuff. Desire exists pre any of that. So it only knows suddenly that something's not there, that it had, that was there. It's been taken. It knows gifting. It knows to give because that's the thing that it like desire can be involved with. But this is not how this works. This is completely different now. We're talking about exchange. Exchange is not within the unconscious. It's a social thing, a social machine, not desire. Now I need to find my way back to whatever fucking page I was on. There it is. That would be my sort of ramble. It's the easiest way to explain it is, again, to talk about how a 3-year-old would act if you were to go, hey, here's $50. Thanks. I'll take your Nintendo from you. Like, they're not going to handle that well.
The market of the home, right?
I have kids, so a lot of my examples are going to revolve around that.
I like your method of grounding, though, right? Like, I will give you $50, but I take your Nintendo. What will you do with this $50? I'd like to see how that plays out, actually, because they can't buy a new Nintendo. But anyways, digressions aside, yeah, to expand on that, right? I kind of read it like when I see exchange and universal exchange, I kind of read it kind of contra Marx, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is different than just kind of basic exchange value, the labor value and market dynamics, right? Instead, what we're dealing with is the use of gifts. So we're not dealing with like equatability. We're always dealing in a sense with a kind of imbalance. So this means a few things, right? One, that's the method, the technology of doing a lot of the codification, right? And we're going to see that in the way that alliances, like we saw earlier in 3.3, right? The way verticals have horizontals introduced, the way flows are given minuses or pluses, right? Allowed to flow or closed off, and the way that that affects the ambiguity of the inclusive disjunction in social production, but also that plus minus sense of the exclusive use, right? So like when we're dealing with this form of gifting, it could be like I give Brooks, a wife, but that doesn't mean he has to reciprocate to me, right? That has implications for the larger group and the way things will flow. And that's kind of the kind of the unique thing about this, right, is, it's not so much about a reciprocity per se. It's about the way that the excess kind of moves about the network, changing what Brooks and I can do, but also changing what's in relation to us and what that can do. And the last part of that I want to emphasize too is that this, right, they're emphasizing codification here. This includes, right, signifiers. This includes methods of signification that are here acting as code, right? And that's kind of the critical thing, like when we're talking about cruelty or bodies marked, right? Is they're marked in this sense according to debt itself, but not through like imbalance, like I said, through kind of a way of movement itself.
Any questions, thoughts, comments? I'll leave it open for a moment. Happy to. And again, these are all really, this is like, there's only 2 paragraphs so far. Like, this is just the middle of a fucking 3-page long paragraph. So we're kind of in the middle of a few points. So don't worry too much. We're getting through it. It's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, as there always is.
Standard French prose, right?
Yeah, this is a good paragraph, though, so I'll just jump in. Will it be said that if desire knows nothing of exchange, it is because exchange is desire's unconscious? Will this be explained by the exigencies of generalized exchange? But what entitles one to declare that shares of debt are secondary compared with a totality that is more real? Yet exchange is known, well known in the primitive socius, but as that which must be exorcised and casted, severely restricted, so that no corresponding value can develop as an exchange value that would introduce the nightmare of a commodity economy. The primitive market operates through bargaining rather than by fixing an equivalent that would lead to a decoding of flux and a collapse of the mode of inscription of the socius. We're brought back to our point of departure. The fact that exchange is inhibited and exercised by no means attests to its primary reality, but demonstrates, on the contrary, that the essential process is not exchanging, but inscribing or marking. And when exchange is made into an unconscious reality, structural rights are invoked in vain, along with the necessary inadequation of attitudes and ideologies in relation to this structure. For one does nothing more than hypostatas the principles of an exchangeist psychology to account for institutions that, on the other hand, are recognized to be non-exchangeist. And above all, what is made of the unconscious itself, if not its explicit reduction to an empty form, from which desire itself is absent and expelled? Such a form can serve to define a preconscious, but certainly not the unconscious. For if it is true that the unconscious has no material or content, this is assuredly not because it is an empty form, but rather because it is always and already a functioning machine, a desiring machine, and not an anorexic structure. So, mostly continuing the point that we were talking about in what was the previous paragraph. They're continuing to do this, and they will continue to bring this up. Their critique shifts a little bit in here. As we said, big push is to understand that it's not so much the exchange, this sort of abstract thing that's driving this. Exchange is known. They're aware of exchange, primitive societies generally, but they don't really allow surplus to be generated from this. They're very, very careful of how exchange happens. Instead, they spend their time bartering. They give chickens for a cow, or for a kill, or for material, or whatever it may be. You bargain, and there's no excess that gets put here. In fact, there's a lot of very, very specific rules to this. When you have excess created, the social rules around it, for example, marriage and other things, are so brutally specifically invoked that you end up with this very specific layer of things that suddenly are expelled from that sort of setup. And so what you end up with in the primitive especially is this absolute need to make sure, again, that debts are understood, that one understands their debt socially, that it isn't this exchangeous notion. You'll hear one of my favorite idiot responses to the social contract is, I never agreed to that. What do I get out of it? That kind of mentality is like, well, it's because people have this weird idea that exchange is what sets up society, that I had to get something or trade for it, that I'm in society because of such a trade, that exchange is the basis of everything. It's not. It's really not. It's debts. And how do we set debts up in a society that has no mobile use of debts, or how mobile they are is really within the things themselves? How do you set up these larger structures of repression? And that's this inscription that they're talking about, because without that, and then they kind of begin making their critique and sort of, critiquing the idea that actually it is exchange. That's fine, because the unconscious is ultimately this sort of empty thing. We have pre-conscious investments, maybe a class investment, a pre-conscious understanding of who we are. We're in this tribe, sure. But the unconscious, there's just not much there. It's nothing going on there. And this setup is really the critique they're making, because they say if it's true that the unconscious has no content, no material, this is not because it's an empty form, but because it is always and already a functioning machine. It's always already working. It is the precursor to these other elements. It is a desire machine, as they say, and not an anorexic structure. Anorexic in the original, one second, I want to make sure I get the translation. Anorexic structure, that's actually interesting phrasing. Wonder why they use that phrasing. I actually haven't looked into that. What do you think it could be, Jack? No?
Anorexic. I don't know, man.
No, this is 100% psychoanalysis. This is some deep Lacan cut from Guattari. I can't think of anything else. Has to be this. So the question is, what would it be and why?
Desire machine, I mean, it looks like a kind of. I mean, it's a bit of it's a bit of a dig, to be frank, right? For if it is true that the unconscious has no material or content, that is assuredly not because it is an empty form. So, right, empty is kind of parallel to the anorexic, but rather because it is always and already a functioning machine, a desired machine, and not an anorexic structure. So, I mean, the point there being that, like, at least as I read it, right, like an anorexic structure would kind of be starving itself of production, in a manner of speaking. Now you have to be careful there, because you don't want to overdo that criticism. But this is just the difference between working at the syntheses and everything through production, as opposed to just making a structuralist interpretation, like they just criticized Levi-Strauss for in the previous paragraph. Although it's funny because, again, for me, kind of the connecting line here is like they're kind of picking on like Marxism here, right? The idea of taking exchange value and kind of labor value and, embedding it in the primitive is being criticized here. Although it's funny because they still talk about a primitive market, right? So it's, in some ways it's kind of true to Capital's first chapter. In other ways, it's kind of, at odds with some of the larger discourse.
Yeah, some of these references, it's just so tough to get into. because that's so to me it's one of the things that Lacan played into a great deal was sort of the anorexic bulimic and sort of how this sort of related to, oh my God, my brain's going to explode, the father and all of these. Like, it feels like they're making a call there, but again, who knows? Who knows? I'm probably going to get it wrong. I should probably shut the fuck up at this point. Fucking Lacan, right? I'm just going to say fucking Lacan because that's just generally accurate.
Yeah, I don't know his relationship to exchangism, but whatever it is there, right?
Oh, he was not based in debt. No.
He was a creditor, right?
Mm-hmm.
One last thing I want to touch on, just very briefly. If you notice in the previous paragraph, they note that gifts and theft are one and the same in a manner of speaking, right? So keep in mind as they're talking about this, right? Like, if this were a market, theft and gift have similar functionality, even though they're different. So one of the things there, right, is when a theft is made, all sorts of things happen, right? Different things are possible. It's not a fluke here.
That's true. So I guess we'll move into the next paragraph. This next one is in the original French, another 3-page paragraph. It is broken up significantly in this one. So it's a little bit different as we make our way through it. I think the best bet would be for us to take a moment. If everyone's good, we can move forward. Because otherwise, like, it's a new thought, because they're going to be talking through kind of what my question was at the end there, which is like, what the fuck? Why would they talk about the anorexic? But it's much more the machine and structure and how we talk about what they are. And again, to your point, Jack, this is where they're making a slight divergence. I don't think as much of one, but I think it's from the wording, especially of Marx, where we're not talking about really structure. It's instead, it's the machinic nature of things and what that means and how structure comes of it. So with that, I can just dive straight fucking in. I'm down. The difference between machine and structure appears in the postulates that implicitly animate the structural and exchanges conception of the socius, with the correctives that must be introduced into this conception so that the structure is able to function. First of all, when considering kinship structures, it is difficult not to proceed as though the alliances derive from the lines of filiation and their relationships, although the lateral alliances and the blocks of debt condition the extended filiations in the system in extension and not the opposite. Secondly, there is a tendency to make the system in extension into a logical combinative arrangement instead of taking it for what it is, a physical system where intensities are distributed, where some cancel out and block a current, where others cause the current to circulate. The objection according to which the qualities developed in the system are not only physical objects, but also honors, responsibilities, privileges, seem to indicate a misunderstanding of the role of the incommensurable elements and the inequalities in the conditions of the system. More precisely, in the third place, the structural exchanges conception tends to postulate a kind of primary equilibrium of prices, a primary equivalence or equality in the underlying principles, which allows it to explain that the inequalities are necessarily introduced in the consequences. There's a reason this is such a long paragraph, because they're about to dive into what they're talking about, which is kinship structures within Strauss. If you remember when we went through this, and it's been weeks and weeks and weeks, the sort of nature of kinship structures as Strauss laid them out, and we sort of discussed them, is that you have like different families and different people inside of the social system. And there is a family that needs to be married to. They're owed a wife. They have like a minus. Then they have a family that has a wife that needs a daughter that needs to be married out. They have a plus. There's this exchange that's happening. There's this larger element that's happening in extension beyond the direct filiative that these alliances are formed in. This kinship structure, it's actually easy for us to make our way through as though these alliances derived from the lines of filiation in their relationships. This is a very specific line. When we look back and we look over all of the work that was done with these, it's easy for us to go, oh, these guys married, and the alliance is because of these two families, like large lines of filiation and their relationships. But it really isn't. Like, it's in retrospect, as we look back over sort of the recording of marriages and everything, it's like, oh, these two families got married here. It's easy for us to say it that way and to think it that way and to talk about it as happening because these two families got together here. But that's not really it. The reality is that it's more that the alliances and the blocks of debt condition the extended filiations in the system and the extension, not the opposite. That the families are almost, they're secondary. They're, fuck them, who cares? It's not that. It's that inside of this network of social signification, there are intensities moving, things moving that are much more imminent. That this family married this family isn't really the point. It's this person married this person because of intensities within that imminent moment. This critique you're going to see happening a lot, and you'll see it's, to me, the like really fantastic sort of way to, you'll start seeing it a lot more as you get deeper into Deleuze. He makes the same play a lot. So does Guattari a lot. The Anti-Oedipus papers, it's a big focus of his. It's understanding sort of the genealogy of the thing to the moment of it, rather than how we sort of retroactively assign the story or the cause or whatever it is. Because it's easy to go back. They say it is difficult not to, but I'll say it's easy to proceed as though the alliances derived from filiations and their relationships. They did not. That is not how it works. Instead, really, the lateral alliances, these connections and the blocks of debt condition the filiations in the system and extension. The alliances defined the meaning of those families and how they were connected. Even though we say these two families married here, it's this marriage happened here and connected these two families. It is a very, very interesting and specific, and yes, seems like annoying little thing, but it is really important when we talk about the sort of retroactive meaning given to these things. Secondly, there's a tendency to make the system an extension, the larger, the full tribe, as for example, into a logical combinative arrangement, instead of taking it for what it is, a physical system where intensities are distributed, where some cancel out and block while others cause a current to circulate. It's easy to look at and presume an almost stability and assume that there is a totality and logic to the way that the families and the tribes and the alliances are set up. It's not that. We look back on it like that. I can go back to 1900 and grab 5,000 people from a town and I can tell you how they're related. But that's more of like this weird sort of thing I can do now. That's not really how they existed. That's not really what it was like at the time. That's not what the intensive systems were. Instead, they really were in each other's way, or being distributed and connecting. There was a lot of stuff happening. The objection, according to which the qualities developed in the system are not only physical objects. This is a great bit, but also honors, responsibilities, and privileges. The big thing, again, is to understand the materiality of what they're playing at here. The materiality is the push. Because we don't just look back and go, oh, it's this arrangement of families. This is how people were connected. This is how, no. It's not that. It's the opposite quat. It's not the Platonic. It's instead understanding there's the immediate reality of how they were made. And in retrospect, we assign a little bit more sort of meaning. And that's their third place, as they say. The structural exchangist conception tends to postulate a kind of primary equilibrium of prices, a primary equivalence or equality in the underlying principle, which allows it to explain that the inequalities are necessarily introduced in the consequences. The reason they put this third, this is, if there is a critique, you should be able to instantly see in Capital, but literally everything. When we start with this structural exchanges conception, we assume it's kind of built in. It's not that we maybe even give it voice, but we think, oh, well, look, at some point, everyone was at zero. So, look, this is just how the system's built. Things go up, things go down. It balances out in the end. That's the sort of implied reality that comes with this exchangeist system, that there is this primary equilibrium of prices and meaning and all these other things. This comes with that. So when we look back at the families, we're saying, oh, look, these families got married here. There's a presumption that the families, one, there's two of them and that they're equivalent. That's silly in a lot of ways. But that the exchange was also even and not fraught with insane amounts of shit in every single direction, which they always would be. There's not that. But we do that because the two families, look, they got married. And then these two people had children. And then these two families, there's this presumption of this base layer of equality, of equilibrium that started all of this. It's fucking wild. But then that in the end is used to go, well, look, so sure, yeah, no, down the road, these families became poor. But look, there's just the consequences of the actions of people over time. That the equalities were introduced in that they chose these things. They made the decision to do this. Not that it started with debt and social and repressed. That plays for the opposite direction. This paragraph is making that argument and starting it, and they're going to continue this through the rest of this. Again, we're only a third of the way through the paragraph in the French, which is always fun. I feel like just diving forward, but please, anyone, if you want to jump in, now would be a good time, because otherwise I am just going to keep going.
I've got a short point to offer, but if anybody wants to go ahead of me, I'd kind of prefer that, actually.
I think you and I are the talkers today, my friend.
Yeah. That's why I'm the wow and flutter.
Go for it, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so just, it's kind of just that last part you were talking about, Brooks. Yeah, so just to, and I think I mentioned this before, but just to kind of reiterate in the context of this paragraph, right? So notice it's not about balancing accounts any more than it is about, like if you happen to have read chapter 1 of Das Kapital, right? It's about the equatability for Marx in terms of commodity and money, right? In this sense, right, that's not what Deleuze and Guattari is saying is happening in primitive. So you don't have equatability, right? At least not directly. And you don't have like an equilibrium in the market, right? So that's like everything hitting a homeostasis, or in a sense, kind of reducing to a changelessness, if you like. So in that sense, right, it's not about balancing the accounts so much as that the accounts themselves are excessive, right? So like trading Jolene for, say, Josephine, right? It's not about the two families trying to arrive at an equivalence. It's that in both cases, what they can do, their signification, right? The flows relative to that group are necessarily altering them and in a process of alteration, right? And that itself is kind of how the debt functions generally, but also in terms of code, right? Because that's going to be the kind of meaning that goes with it, so that what they can do and what the things related to them can do is going to change. I guess I can't say it with that it's change with that trade. I have to forego the rhyme there.
All right. Whew. So this next bit is getting deep into some anthropology wonkery, to put it very, very lightly. To put it very, very lightly. So we will spend probably the rest of this talk on this paragraph because it's going to be important for us to go back and revisit and talk through where Strauss and Leach disagreed, what that meant, and a little bit of the history there, because I think it's super important to have that sort of discussion overall, for sure. So, I guess I'll just dive forward then. Nothing is more significant in this regard than the controversy between Levi-Strauss and Leach concerning the Kachin marriage system, invoking a, quote, conflict between the egalitarian conditions of generalized exchange and its aristocratic consequences. Levi-Strauss acts as though he thought the system were in a state of equilibrium. However, the problem is altogether different. It's a question of knowing if the disequilibrium is pathological and a manifestation of consequences, as Levi-Strauss maintains, or functional and fundamental, as Leach argues. Is the instability derived in relation to an ideal of exchange, or is it already given in the preconditions, included in the heterogeneity of the terms that compose the prestations and counterprestations? The more one directs one's attention to the economic and political compromises conveyed by the alliances, to the nature of the counterprestations that come to compensate the disequilibrium of the prestation of wives, and generally the original manner in which the aggregate of prestations is evaluated in a particular society, the more clearly the necessarily open nature of the system in extension appears, as in the case of the primitive mechanism of surplus value as surplus value of code. But, and this is the fourth point, the exchangeist conception finds it necessary to postulate a closed system, statistically closed, and to shore up the structure with a psychological conviction, the confidence that the cycle will reclose. Thus, not only the essential opening of the blocks of debt, according to the lateral alliances and the successive generations, but above all, the relationship of the statistical formations to their molecular elements, find themselves brought back to the simple empirical reality, insofar as it is not adequate to the structural model. So, when we talk about this sort of disagreement between them, so areas of Burma, Myanmar today, the Kachin people who lived there had very unique sort of setups when it came to how different tribes would intermarry and how it would happen. One of the challenges, and it's they outline it, I think, really cleanly, but basically Strauss came at everything as he always did. He was super structuralist and really wanted to find those underlying patterns, and he could see them, and he could find the sort of universal structures that existed inside of these kinship within the Kachin. It isn't really, as he would say, it isn't really two people getting married, which is fair. It's a contract between groups. It says these larger groups that allow this sort of larger exchange. But this sort of is an idealistic view of it. It's a representational view of it. It's a view that allows sort of the schema and the blueprint of things to sort of gain a little bit of, you could say, precedence. It privileges it, like we were talking about earlier when we say that we go to a child and we say, oh, we're going to give you $100, don't worry, and we take their candy. They don't give a shit because they don't understand that kind of thing. So instead, going back and talking about the complexities and strangeness that is social life, Leach argued very far back, and I think he did stunning work on it. We went over it last time. It's a worthwhile read if you want to go sort of deep into this to understand, but that the social structure of the Kachin, it isn't static. His argument would be that even as you go generation to generation, for Strauss, it would be like, here's how the Kachin operate. And he give you some baselines and a schema, and it's like, cool. And he'd be like, and Leach is like, no, dude, literally every marriage almost wholly changed that entire society. And at the same time, the realities of the economic and political factors around it changed every marriage. These things are constantly shifting. And the way that kinship and marriage began to work shifted enough. Now, Strauss's argument is that the underlying stuff doesn't matter. The underlying thing's the same. They do this. This is what they do. I found this commonalities, and there it is. And Leach would be like, but the commonalities like ignore the lived reality of what these things did, the complexity and the crazy shit, and those rigid frameworks that you had, that tight setup that you're demanding that everything be shown into. It forgets really how social organization works, how negotiation operates, and how power dynamics between different groups, or the, one tribe being more starving than the other, it's not balanced. You can't, they're hungrier. What are you going to fucking do? Let them, like, it's a really sort of bullshit thing to do. And this became a critique across sort of general anthropological circles that they're continuing here in this book, but I will tell you has continued, I think, still is continuing a lot through this day. You'll see people having these almost same arguments, but ultimately that social systems aren't static, that the schema isn't static. Instead, it's a constant push-pull of a lot of dynamics that are happening all the time. And this is the thing that they're driving at in these last few paragraphs leading to this, as they move into the fourth thing that they talk about. And they start moving finally the sort of, the last sort of play of this as they make their move. I want to make sure I get the phrasing right. Apologies. The fourth point, the exchangist conception, the Straussian sort of structural conception, finds it necessary to postulate a closed system, statistically closed, to shore up the structure with a psychological conviction. Don't worry, the cycle will come back on itself. Don't worry, the economy will repair itself. It's claiming that the social system is ultimately closed, and as such, things outside of it, but there's nothing's outside of it. Things are accounted for, and it'll be fine. Don't worry, the cycle will happen again. But this forgets an extraordinary amount of things, a huge number of things. But as their critique says, not only the essential opening of the blocks of debts according to lateral alliances in successive generations, but above all, the relationships of these statistical formations to their molecular elements. They find themselves brought back to this simple empirical reality, insofar it is not adequate to the structural model. You see these desires, the unconscious crushed again, eliminated again, pushed again. And it's because we have, if you want to talk about, like, we get asked a lot, like, what is representational thinking? Well, you're starting to see it. You're starting to see how that operates, how people put themselves in the position of that, and how these things work. Where it's, this is how the Kachin get married. This is how the structures work. And it's like, kind of a lot more complex than that, actually. And that's really oversimplifying. Yeah, but the structure's there. All the rest of it is just details and empty. And it's the empty unconscious bullshit. The structures are what matter. And that's could not be further from them. Yeah. Jack, anyone?
Yeah, to add a little bit to that. Okay, so yeah, I mean the basic distinction here is whether this is, so again, like they're working off the affiliative and the alliance, right? They're working off of very much in the, so far we've seen them focus on the second synthesis, right? How Newman functions, which, as we noted in the beginning, right, they've maintained is consistent with libido, right? So we're just talking about production in that sense for them. We're not desexualizing, what they call the libidinal economy, right? So in that sense, are the kind of socioeconomical, we'll say political aspects and like realizations of things, are those consequence. Are those consequences from structure as Levi-Strauss would have it, right? Are they manifestations of structure in a sense? Or are they more fundamental as with Leach, right? Now, obviously D and G are going like they're more fundamental, right? They're part of the foundation of production. They are production itself for D and G, right? Um, in social production, right? Because we're talking about reliant and affiliative. So the reason I'm bringing it back to that point, they kind of slipped this in, and it's kind of really important because obviously there's an engagement with some of the Marxian economics here, but also a distinction from it, right? So they've distinguished that they're not doing exchange value, right? By extension, you might be wondering, is there a surplus value, right? They're returning to that point here when they say, this is too long of a sentence. The more one directs one's attention to the economic and political compromises conveyed by the alliances, so right, we're still talking about disjunction here, to the nature of the counter-prestations that come to compensate the disequilibrium of the prestations of wives, and generally the original manner in which the aggregate of prestations is evaluated in a particular society, the more clearly the necessarily open nature of the system and extension appears. Right. So notice they're moving into that second part of the second synthesis in social production, right, which is when the earth or the socius appears as the condition of production. This point about extension is giving us that critical mass there. And this becomes particularly important because they go on to say, and this is where they just slip it in, as in the case of the primitive mechanism of surplus value as a surplus value of code. Right, so there it is. The reason I'm focusing on this is because to the degree that they're concerned with debts, to the degree that we keep focusing on inscription, right, this is one of the major reasons why, because in this sense, it's not about producing like a disequilibrium so as to produce like a disequilibrium in labor value or the distribution of labor value or the equivalency of labor values, right? Which would kind of be a more standard Marxian way of talking about it, particularly for capitalist economics for political economy, right? In the sense we're familiar. Deleuze and Guattari, what they're saying is, no, it's not that so much as it is, right? The excesses itself are functionally moving across the groups, right? And in that, their capacities are changing, the flows themselves are changing, right? There is debt being produced and taking on signification, and that's the point itself, because that is the excess that's created so that the socius can produce the surplus value of code, which is why, going back to like the main point of this fourth one, which is why it's an open system, right? In this sense, the excess keeps it expansive rather than condensing into an equilibrium where things would kind of hit like a point of, not too little of this, but not too much of that. Kind of a homeostasis is the common term. On the contrary, the surplus value of code keeps production expansive in a manner of speaking. And that's kind of the critical thing that this focus on the second synthesis is giving us so far in the section. As implications for the first and third, as always, but just keeping it kind of simple right now. Want to ask any questions? No, I was just going to ask while we're stopped here. I get the generally a lot. This would be a good place to ask questions, even even if you're generally getting it, just to check. Because at this point, they've restated a lot of things in this content, so it's a good it's a good check-in checkpoint.
I'm just wondering about the instability word here. Like it says, is the instability derived in relation to the ideal of exchange? Like things are changing and they're talking about disequilibrium. Does that mean instability and that they're afraid the whole thing's going to fall apart? They just don't like that it's always changing, or they don't like that the structure's changing. And
Yeah, it's a solid question. So like in economics, right, like instability is kind of the impetus for equilibrium, right? Because
oh,
what equilibrium gives you is homeostasis, or kind of a point where things really aren't changing a lot, right? That's that point if you suffered through the dismal science, right? The straight lines drawn, or you
mm-hmm,
have that little square, and things are kind of easy there because expectations are pretty fixed, right? What
mm-hmm,
Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that it's not even about disequilibrium, it's that it's necessarily about the excess itself, so that it doesn't become a question of equalization or disequalization necessitating equalization. It just keeps it in, what for them would be instability, but what is more generally just like, it's the excess of production.
okay.
Trying to connect the idea of representation with his notion of the society consists of debts and not exchanges. So um, is he saying that there's a kind of the notion of exchanges um, is a form of representation then?
It's getting there, and they'll be coming sort of back to it a lot as we make our way through. But there, it's very easy to say Strauss, because I think even outright says it, that his sort of notion of how society exists is exchangeist. It's that people trade things, people work together, and that things sort of balance out. It's this idea, and that's it. To go back to the previous question, this is the the way we look at instability versus what, to Jack's point, and I think that's kind of the thing they're saying is, as they say, it is instability derived in relation to an ideal of exchange, or is it already given in the preconditions? This is the question for Leach and Strauss. This is actually directly what Leach's critique is the instability, that there was no stability in the way that the marriage ceremonies and the way these things carried out. They changed kind of constantly, unless you went to these very particular abstract elements, right? That setup of marriages over time, you can look at, 1,000 marriages, find patterns, go, that's the setup. The reality is that's kind of just, if you're only looking at like, did people get married and who, as like a sort of family tree. If you're talking about sort of the functional parts of society, how it was experienced, how it was lived, what happened, why these marriages happened, how they happened, what drove people to marry certain other people, you start getting into, as what Leach was talking about here, which is this deeply unstable reality of changes that were always happening, this dynamism of these marriages and how they went forward. So you kind of have inside of anthropology, but I would say inside of a lot, this idea of that a society built on exchange, everyone starts at some equal footing, or did at one point, or that in society it's always close. That the instability is fine because ultimately there's a stability we're waiting for. It's instability against a stability. Because again, you can't say something's unstable if it was never stable. You don't go like it's stability is this idealized notion. You have to have a version of it. So that's their point, is like, by saying, oh, look, there's instability here. That's like pretending like that's the unique thing. Whereas if you were to say the opposite, like, look, oh my God, there's stability happening over here, that's the exception. Again, how we talk about these things and what we use and how we describe them and the strata, the schema we build matters a huge deal to these things, even if it seems like it's such a simple, well, but no, what's the foundation? The foundation for Strauss was that things are exchangist and balanced, that there's an equilibrium, that there's a closed system, that these things work very nicely. Now, sometimes they may get broken, but don't worry, because ultimately, and Leach was like, no, dude, look at how the Kachin, and he went way deeper than Strauss did. He's like, look, every one of these marriages, these are fucked up social mores being sort of bent or broken, and people trying, like, it was wild, the stories that he came up with. That was his critique, is that it's not so much that the instability is derived in relation to an ideal of stability or exchange being that stability, that we've agreed this marriage should happen, or that my labor is worth $5, or that I can give you 2 chickens for a cow. Those are equal. That's equilibrium. But instead that there's a lot more happening beyond just what was in that literal exchange. And instead the social machines and everything else playing out, which means there's a general instability and actually a stability. Like if we ever had a real exchange that was like equal, that would be worth putting in a fucking museum. Does that make sense?
All
right, go for it, Jack.
Build on that. I kind of cut it from a different angle too, right? So like what they're kind of critiquing here too is like the idea that you could impose a commodity market on the primitive market is a mistake, right? It's a mislocation of a commodity market in a sense. Or another way to say it is it doesn't recognize the conditions of production of the primitive, right? So in that sense, to apply the commodity market in general is just an overall mistake, right? And I say that because I don't want to quite hit it from the representational angle there. Where I would access representation would be through I would start with the alliance itself, because it gives you that shared point between the second synthesis, right? And just in general, and with the alliance's role in the fourth paralogism as doing the repression, right? So in that sense, alliance plays a role in creating the representation and doing the repressing, just like it plays a role in the actual inscriptive process for the primitive.
To read Arachne, there's never a moment in history where someone adheres to the example economists give of, I have a goat, you have bread. How do we trade them? Money. That's value, this mediation of things. It can't be deduced from natural things, but from this ideal of accumulation, repetition. Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. Again, it's the goal of a lot of this is to get back to this sort of an economics of unconscious and to understand how the unconscious factors into these elements. And when we idealize the Kachin marriage ceremony, we turn it into, look, these families got together, they exchanged. And from that, there's like almost a new level of balance. But that's not really how it ever works. You never really have that exchange that resets things. It's always fucked up. It's always dynamic, which was Leach's point. How this fits into the earth, and we're going to get into a lot here. When, like, to go back to, and I still think that talking about this through the Marxist lens of like the material conditions that create a town or a social group, especially in these primitive societies, the area that they live in determines what animals they hunt, where they hunt, how they hunt, what they grow, how they grow. And that's in turn, how much they grow or how they grow or where they grow is determined by the people. So there's this kind of back and forth where, you know, when a new person enters an area, let's say they're a blank person, let's say they just arrive and they're like 20 years old, they can figure out pretty quickly and look around and go, hey, oh, these guys have been working this area for some time. Like you can guess a history sort of by looking at the things that are there. You can see the memory, the recordings in the earth of that tribe, of those people. You can see it. You can literally do this now, by the way. Go look around, pick a country, and you can start to see really the recordings over time. You can see capital moving. Like as you start doing it, it's amazing the way that we've etched into the earth. But much more way back, these tribes etched into the earth. Now, this etching that happens into the earth obviously sets up certain things. You're not going to, go hunting in the area someone's got a pasture for their ox, because you'll be killing their ox. So there's kind of sets around and codes of what does where and who does what where and all of that. So the earth does that. But there's a lot more going on, because again, what stops someone from exercising their desire immediately, the consuming of the desire as it's created, the germinal flux, the dude who has sex with his daughter, mom with the child, the hunter who eats his own kill, the cook who devours the entire meal and leaves nothing for anyone. What's to stop that from happening? Well, their argument, and it's Nietzsche's argument in Genealogy of Morals, and I think it's generally speaking a pretty solid one, is it's also, just as we etched in the earth, we etch in the skin, we etch in the body, that we utilize the same system to etch and to write. That thing, that's the sort of play that we're making here, that the etching that's happening in the earth and the etching that's happening in the BWO, the recording over time, just as when you dig into the ground with a plow. You do that over and over, and you will end up with a trench. Great. This etching, and that trench there, by the way, that's now a thing. That trench is there, and it's been done many times. This is where we dig trenches, and you can tell because the ground has been tilled, and it's a specific kind of ground. And here's what we've grown there. Like the history of the thing can be seen. The BWO is not drastically different from this. The etching that needs to happen is different, though, because the way desire within the earth, within the primitive functions, it's in line with the social like these things are right next to each other. I am right here in the earth. I'm doing what's needed based around what's right around me. But how do we keep that stuff right around you that stops you from stealing, from taking, from overindulging, from taking that germinal influx and just devouring it instantly? And we do that by carving into you, just as we did into the earth, so that the codes can't leave you, so that your memory is so intensely held, the cruelty is so extreme that you're kept. And this is, as far as I'm aware, a fair way to talk about a lot of these primitive tribes who have these ceremonies. Once you're 12, 13, is horrifying shit of pain and scarification or tattooification and an amazing sets of things that are deeply taboo to us now. Yes, high school. It's exactly like high school, Quad. I would agree. At least it was, unique story for me. But still, the setup basically puts us in a position of that thing is then so recorded in us, in the flesh, the mnemotechnic system that they're talking about, as they quote Nietzsche. This thing carries, and what it carries with us is those codes, or probably better said, the understanding of what not to do. So intensely, so deeply carved that it will never leave us. So when we talk about the territorial socius or the earth socius, they use the terms a little bit differently and depending on context. We're talking about the earth socius. Very often they're talking about sort of how things are recorded into the earth. But what is recorded? Well, it's territory. We territorialize. We create the edges. We are one with the edges almost as we carve them not only into the earth but into ourselves. The territorial socius is right there. And the debts and the realities and the experiences of everyone that's dynamically happening is always recorded. It's always written down. They don't get to have surplus. They don't get to have profit like we do. These things are tightly regulated, and they have these extraordinary ceremonies to make sure surplus never accumulates, so that way no one can ever be in a position to have surplus. And this is the territorial socius, how repression exists, how desire is produced, and how our meaning of things, the sense of life, is made all there. Does that make sense, Arachne? Does that help? Good. Because we hit 2 o'clock and it's time for me to get back to work. Someday I fantasize that I'll actually make, $20 doing this. But for now, thank all of you for joining us. This has been, as always, a highlight of my week. I love it. And next week we will continue from right here as we make our way continuing through the savage formations. And this is where we start getting into what we were talking about. I was just talking about here with Arachne and going over how inscription happens and how it works, because there's an extraordinary play as we start making our way through how representation works in this space versus how it changes under future socii. So until then, thank all